I think one of the things that we don't realize a lot of the times with trauma is, and in some, textbooks and in some science research things, we talk about grief and loss. And some people say, well, I'm not grieving anything. I haven't lost anything. Um, Folks, the fact of the matter is we do every day. Every day we're grieving the loss of something. Hello, psych fans. Welcome to another fun-filled, action-packed day of psychology. I am here, Spence Kohler, the psycho, the psycho
Oh, we're starting great.
educator, the psycho educationalist. I don't know. I can make up a whole bunch of titles for myself. I think that'd be fun. And my co-host with me tonight.
Is Allison Fabricius coming to you out of my recording closet. Uh, Excited to have a fun-filled discussion around if I'm remembering sort of how we parsed this, it is sort of the different things that make up our responses to the world around us. That's an incredibly vague way to what to call it, but I think it's we're discussing around brain, the nervous system, and the endocrine system and how they all work together that then affect us and how we engage with the world and how we function with other people. So I'm very excited to learn more about this. For this discussion, I'll be talking about synapses a lot because like synapses and trauma and recovery because I just find that fascinating. But I'm gonna tee it back up for Spencer, who right before we hit record went, so Allison, how do we want to talk about this? We know what we're
What
talking
what
about.
direction are we headed here?
Because we could probably make this like a 5-part series. We'll see where we end up. Today might be the overview, and then if you, dear listeners, would like a deeper dive into any particular topic, please let us know. But I'm gonna tee it back to you and say, so Spencer, what's your question for me today?
Well, I think I've got a direction. We'll start running with this, and you just guide me with questions or whatever else happens to come up here. But um, I think one of the things that I love about this, I sometimes term it the Holy Trinity of mental health, and I think there's an important thing when you go in and start the process of therapy, which is a lot of what we're talking about here on our show and what we're really trying to unpack for our audience. It's important to keep in mind that there are these three main areas that we are going to focus on. Three main areas that we really need to watch, and that is the brain, that is the endocrine system, and that is the nervous system. And one of the easier places to start is the brain, and then we'll kind of work our way down from there. So a lot of people sit back and say, okay, what's going on with me? What's happening? And some people go to a doctor, and the doctor doesn't know what's wrong with them, and they say, well, it's all in your head, right? And you're like, you're no help. Why did I pay you all this money? Um, but in a way, there is something to that, and maybe it just takes a little bit more understanding or a little bit more information. Now, we're not going to go through and define like every single part and get into the technicality of names and stuff, but it's really helpful to look at the main portions of the brain and be able to say, hey, this is this lobe and this is what it does. So essentially, we start out with the frontal lobe, for a lack of a better term. And like I said, we're not using the scientific anatomy terms, but the frontal lobe is a place of where we find our personality. And we find characteristics about our personality. We also find an element of decision making. So if this frontal lobe is firing off very well, then we should have our personality intact. We should have characteristics of our personality, which may, fluctuate over the course of, years and years and years and years. Um, we also have the decision making that is the going off here, where when we're making decisions and choices from this frontal lobe, that means that there are other parts of the brain that are not necessarily taking over. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by that later on.
Okay, so while you're breathing, just one
Yeah,
second. How would you define a personality?
that's a really good point. And I will define that by telling you how we look at it in the DSM.
Okay.
So, for example, in the DSM, there are currently in DSM 5, I believe there is 10, if I counted correctly, 10 personality disorders. Okay. So, we're talking about narcissistic personality disorder. We're talking about histrionic personality disorder. And so these disorders are, I mean, function in different ways depending upon what we're talking about. And they're different than something like ADHD. It's not a personality disorder, right? There's no personality in the title whatsoever there. So ADHD can still be a way of how we think, per se, and not necessarily affect our personality. Whereas if things are not firing properly in the frontal lobe, there can be some personality issues that are happening there. So some things like social cues or reading other people. If we take narcissists, for example, part of their personality issue is that they have this inability to look inward, right? And they have a hard time being self-aware of themselves and sometimes others, right?
Hmm.
Even though it tends to be all about me. And histrionic personality disorder is all about me as well. But essentially, a personality are those characteristics that make you who you are. This is made up of our attitudes. This is made up of our beliefs. This is made up by our upbringing, our, all the different things that we take, like the way we laugh, right? The way we express anger, the way we express all these different emotions. All of that is part of one's personality. And that's when we look at personality disorders, we sit back and we say, okay, what is the problem here? Empathy is a really hard thing for narcissists. And some people who are really empathetic, well, that's part of their personality. Some people who aren't or have a lack thereof, it can be part of a personality disorder. Does that help unwrap things? Would you add anything to that, Allison?
I think, oh, we could go from a metaphysical route, but we won't. But I think for me, if I were to summarize, I don't know that I have a lot to add, but I think I would just summarize and say
Hmm.
personality is kind of what makes us who we are
Right.
from an internal world perspective, and then how that internal world affects our outer world.
Hmm.
And I think that we inherently have certain skills and abilities and inclinations of how we interact in the world and how we care about people. Like when we talk about like love languages, I think we have
Hmm.
those are kind of things that are just inherently part of our personality. Like food is my love like is how I show love. Like I have
Hmm.
to make sure that people have are well fed and taken care of, or just the fact that I really love books and I love
Hmm.
reading and I love learning, or the fact that I really enjoy public speaking. Those are things, that combination of stuff, of characteristics and skills and likes and dislikes are kind of what makes me me. And so I think of a personality as that's the recipe that you
Hmm.
get me. And then you check in memories and you check in traumas, big T and little t, and those influence the personality. So we have who we are at the core, and then we can layer on other stuff as life happens. And if, as you mentioned, the DSM, personality disorders, we call them a disorder. I'm gonna make a guess here, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because they
Hmm.
affect individuals' ability to show up in the world in a vulnerable or connective way.
Hmm.
And so it's not necessarily that like those disorders don't make people bad people. They don't
No.
like this isn't a value-based judgment of like the person themselves, but it is they have a hard time connecting with the world in real and vulnerable ways. And as I mentioned in the very first podcast, one of my hopes with this podcast is to help us create more deeply connective relationships because I think deep connections and vulnerable trusting relationships will change the world. And
Hmm.
so those disorders make that a little harder. And some of those disorders, if you can kind of understand the cheat codes, if you understand what's going on, you can kind of create supports and cheat codes that help you interact with your environment in more fulfilling ways. And in some cases, with some disorders, it just doesn't happen. So, or it's a much steeper hill to climb, and there's a much steeper learning curve. But so that would be my condensing of personality. And when we're saying disorder, we're not judging the person. We're just saying their inner world and their outer world have a hard time interacting to have
Hmm.
relationships that they might hope to have, or to
Hmm.
be able to engage in the world fully and completely.
Right. Love it. Love it. Great addition there. I appreciate it. So if we're
Sorry, one other thought that I
oh
had that I
yes. Oh yes,
traumatic brain
yes.
injuries, especially ones that affect the front of your front lobe, that's
Hmm.
another example of if people, those can greatly impact people's personalities.
Hmm.
Just because that's the part of the brain, that frontal lobe is what houses our personality. So
Hmm.
traumatic brain injuries, once again, affect how your inner and your outer world engage. And so
Hmm.
they're a kind of an important piece to this puzzle to understand
Hmm.
personality as a whole.
And that's an element where we get into part of personality characteristics can also have to do with self-control.
Mm,
Which if we have somebody who has a damage to the frontal lobe in some way, shape, or form, the decision-making ability to have control, let's say if somebody confronts us with an issue and it causes anger, right? We can tend to overreact or be aggressive or all these different things. And a lot of that comes down to, hey, there is some damage there in the brain. And we're going to talk about like you wanted to. We're going to talk about the synapses. We're going to talk about how they fire, and we're going to talk about how that process goes together, because it's really important. So this is like the 30,000 foot view, and then we'll zoom in a little bit more. So if we're moving up to the top of your head, for example, we would land somewhere on the parietal lobe. Now, this is a really interesting place. This is where we have identification. Okay. One of the things that's interesting is there are some people, there again, who have damage in this region of the brain, who have an inability to recognize objects.
mm,
Facial recognition is also in this area of the brain, right? So identifying people, places, things, objects is a huge part of our ability to make up the world around us. So if there's damage here, there's problems in those particular areas. Okay.
And also,
Um,
like, it also can just be another like diagnosable disorder. Like, even if
yeah.
there isn't damage, some people just don't have the right connections, and
Hmm.
so they just don't learn faces.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. So, this is where we come to interpret pain. We also interpret touch. We also interpret sensations in this particular area. Now, one of the things that's interesting about interpreting this stuff is it interprets it only so far. So, for example, our bodies don't necessarily quite interpret the difference between emotional pain and physical pain. So, for example, I could be feeling anger right in my chest, and I
Mhm.
could be thinking, oh, I'm having some type of heart attack, right? Or there could be something physical that is in there because I feel it physically, but is it really something physically wrong with me? So that's where sometimes we get, and there's another episode, we could unpack with this one right here. But essentially, one of the things we need to make sure and understand is that yes, if I feel those butterflies in my stomach, it doesn't necessarily mean that I ate something bad if I'm about ready to get up and give a speech, right? Or if I am going to walk in and talk to my boss about a raise, or go in for a job interview. So there are some things that we have a hard time differentiating between the two. So sometimes, and I know some people in this day and age that have gone to specialist to specialist to specialist and says, I have a pain, I have an issue, right? Well, sometimes we don't necessarily recognize if it is actually physical or if it's mental or if
Slash
it's emotional.
emotional.
Yeah, slash emotional. Good. So that's something that we need to mention here because that's important as we go around the brain here. But those are the important things of the parietal lobe. It's also where, like I said, we recognize relationships. We understand the different relationships, and it's important that if there's damage here, there can be problems and issues. Like I said, it's hard if you damage this area with identifying and recognition, and how that has a difficulty on relationships. This area of the brain is also a place where they look in, and Alzheimer's plays a certain role and
Mhm.
part in here, in things because we don't necessarily recognize our surroundings and where we are and all those different things. So, parietal lobe, folks, that's what that is. Okay, so on the back of our head is our occipital lobe, and this primarily has to do with vision. Bump ching. Need we say more? Let me add to this a little bit because some people might sit back and say, well, vision is not really mental health wise. Yeah, yeah, I totally understand that, but um, there is so much going on here because there are so many nerve endings right behind each of our eyes, and they are connected directly. The only sense that we have that has a direct connection to the brain, right? Like skin, the skin is not necessarily connected to our brain. Um, it has to go through the nervous system. Our smell, our olfactory, right? The smell sensation goes. It's close to the brain, but it's not necessarily. There's nothing connecting it like our vision. So there's a whole part of the brain that has to do with that visual ability for us to add to the rest of these. So again, identifying objects in the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, that has to be able to see it. And we not only have to see it, but most of us see things, well, all of us see things upside down, and this part of the brain helps us see right side up. If not, we would all be walking around on our heads. So,
I can see
um,
that that would be slightly limiting.
yeah, just a little bit. But still very, very important because it has a whole lot to do with all the other characteristics and all the other different parts of the brain there. Down at the very base is the cerebellum, where this is our coordination of our body, our movement, our balance. If this area gets damaged, it throws off our ability to keep ourselves walking in a straight line, which actually they did research not too long ago. They took a bunch of people, put a GPS on them, and took them out to the woods and said, walk in a straight line. Well, we can't do that.
That's not
we,
encouraging.
I know, right? We don't quite have the guide map or compass in our nose as some of our other animal friends on this planet. So yeah, it's a little bit hard to walk in a straight line when we don't have any bearings, like we can't see the sun, we can't see stars, all that kind of fun stuff. So
Quick question.
yeah,
So, paralysis, because you're talking about the part of the brain that direction and keeps us moving and all the things. Is paralysis mostly based in like injuries to the spinal column, or can you also have paralysis from a brain injury?
good question. It can be both.
Ooh.
Yeah, it can be both because there are some instances where we have recorded people who have suffered a very, very traumatizing situation. And they will, in fact, have some type of paralysis in the body. Like, for example, they can't walk, they can't feel legs from the waist down, for example. Now, this doesn't happen for everybody, but in some situations, in some cases, this is where, you could go through X-ray, you could go through CT, you can go through MRI, and we can look at these different things and we can say, hey, there's no damage necessarily in the spinal column. So why is this individual not able to walk? Well, there is some type of paralysis. There's something happening trauma wise that is shut down in the brain. And that's when we have to bring in, psychiatric help and therapy and other things to help work through that trauma so that our brain will release, tell the nervous system, hey, guess what? Legs, you're really
We're
not. You're really not
It's John
damaged.
Watson. It's
Yeah.
John Watson from the new not the more recent Sherlock BBC
Sherlock. Yeah.
version
Yeah.
of he has a psychosomatic limp, and
Yeah.
the one of the telltales is that he limps when he's walking, but he
hmm
can stand without even thinking about it.
Right.
And and it's because that part of his brain shut down
hmm
because of traumatic events. And I think an important piece to keep in mind here is people don't choose this. Like this
No.
isn't a like I want to be lazy or I don't want to do this anymore. And it's not a conscious choice. It is your brain going, we have too much in here to keep going on with life the way that we've been going on with life.
Right.
And
Right.
so we don't there is still a whole bunch about our brains that we don't understand, and there's
Oh
a
no.
whole bunch about survival mechanisms that we don't understand. And so it is just important to understand that the brain's gonna brain, and we don't always get to choose how it's coping and healthy responses and unhealthy responses. And this is true of like the brain itself, but also as we've been talking over the last episodes, just how our body goes into survival mode. We don't always get to choose how what coping mechanisms our body chooses. So just
Yeah.
want to offer some grace in this circumstance that our brain just does stuff and we
Yeah.
do the best that we can to suss out what it did and why it's doing it and how we can help it. So,
You bet. On that note, there's a great book that I recently read, and I think I've mentioned it before, that has to do with pain and how here in America we are so stuck on chronic illnesses.
mhm.
And we're one of the only countries in the various nations and stuff as far as medical is concerned to where chronic is a part of our medical vernacular. And one of the things that I find wonderfully interesting is that you can have a back injury and it can heal. And in logical healing time of, say, maybe a month or two or three, you should be completely, totally healed and the pain should be gone. However, during that amount of time, the brain can also adapt and say, oh, maybe we need to stay in pain and maybe we need to keep having pain. And pain is a good thing in the back because then that means we get to rest or we get to relax or all these different things. So, pain is a very interesting thing in which we find that if people and just like the whole, Dr. Watson thing. For example, if we get to a point where maybe our mind is distracted, maybe we're reading a really good book, and all of a sudden the pain is not there. And some people say, "Oh, you just don't notice it." Really? Okay, well, can we not just notice it all the time? You know? And you can train the brain to be able to do that, to read pain signals for what they really, really are. And so when we look at chronic pain and we look at problems and issues like that, yeah, we look at the brain and where things are firing and seeing if we can reroute thought patterns to help with some of those things. And it's the same thing with a limp. It's the same thing with temporary paralysis. Um, MASH even did an episode on it. If anybody is a MASH, fan,
Huge MASH
yeah,
fan.
right, me too. And here, this kid comes in and he's not able to walk, and he's like, well, yelling at the doctor, he's yelling at Pierce. He's like, well, don't you think I want to walk? Well, yeah, of course you do, but it takes rewiring and rethinking the brain to make it work. And
Well,
and
and the brain has really good reason to not want to walk in that circumstance. Like
right.
that kid has seen things that no one should ever see. So
hmm
his body, speaking of the brain's gonna brain, like
hmm
his body might have had a physical shock to it, but then the brain went, huh, this provides us some opportunities. And it's not even, I don't even think our brain is like that maniacal under the surface, like
Evil maniacal
Machiavellian.
brain.
But I think it's just the body's going to survive. We're just not going to walk.
hmm
And and it'll be fine.
Okay, so the next up is the spinal cord, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Obviously, that sends information, and that has a lot to do with the central nervous system, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But essentially, that connects our brain to our nervous system, and helps us be a part of the whole system connected to the other two. Um, just up above the spinal cord is what we call the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe has a lot to do with our memory. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. You would think that memory would have a whole heck of a lot to do with identification, right? Identification is a form of memory. But what we found is short-term memory is stored in this particular area. So, all of you folks who have ever crammed for a final exam, because it is that time of the year, or those of you who have tried to remember somebody's phone number or address without writing it down, you try to cram that in a short term memory type of situation. In which it will stay there for that short amount of time and then be replaced by other information. It has to move elsewhere in order to go into long-term memory. Well, this temporal lobe also has to do with our speech and our language. So it's really interesting that people who have traumatic brain injuries, there can be some kind of speech impediment. There can be other problems. Some of us may relate to this by saying, has anybody ever been so mad that you stutter or trip over your words or all those different, yeah, right? When we have these things creep up, it means that our brain is not necessarily computing fast enough, or we are just too dysregulated in order to be able to understand what's going on and happening.
And
And so our
sometimes both can be true.
both can be true, yeah. And so then we lose, the ability to actually speak and express ourselves and all that kind of interesting stuff. This area too is very mathematical, and I will tell you why. This is also where musical rhythm comes into play.
Hmm.
So, for our dancing skills or just enjoying a really good beat in music, it makes a huge difference.
So not our
Now,
nunchuck skills,
no,
just our beat skills.
right, yeah.
Okay.
So this is more of our rhythmic ability and stuff. It's also the part of the brain that we see responses in to music stimuli. So that's where we get the whole theory of, oh, if you play, classical music, right? This part of the brain can be active and waves can be coming from it, or colors tend to show up on certain scans because there's a lot of activity going on when we are exposed to music, which music is a very mathematical type of language to interpret. There again, this is part of language, musical rhythm, all that kind of stuff. All happens in this temporal lobe, and a lot of really cool things to unpack there. But the important part is the memory when it comes to mental health. The short term memory is a tool for us to help rewire our brains. So we start out with a lot of this information, like when we learn a new psychoeducational tool to use. Hopefully, some of you learn these tools as we're talking in this podcast. But if some of these things register in your mind, that's great. This is popping up in your temporal lobe, and then you can take that and move it to other parts of your brain to make it more solidified to long-term memory and other areas and parts and stuff.
So
So
where is long-term memory?
that's a really good question. Where do you think it is?
In the center of the brain? Because we've covered all the other stuff.
That is a really good question. And I'm going to switch screens here so I can answer your question because it's a really good one because it's important to understand. Um,
I did horribly cut you off though. So while you're switching, how were you going to finish short term? You just said you have to move it to other parts of the brain, and I'm like, well, then where, where do you move
right?
it
Where,
to?
where are we moving all that stuff to? That essentially leads me into when we're talking about the synapses and the brain firing and all that kind of fun stuff, which I think is absolutely, totally, and completely exciting. To house some of these things in our brain. So we have a whole bunch of information that's going on happening in our brain. And um, one of the things that I love about it is that our brains are constantly able to be, trained and engineered and changed. Like our brains are not stuck in one way or another. Depending upon if we're talking about, a damaged brain, traumatic brain injury, that's something different. But for the most part, an average human brain has the ability to adapt. Um, and that is really cool because it's important to unpack so that we don't sit back and say, "Oh, well, I have this problem. Um, I can't change it. It's just the way I am. It's just who I am, right?" And that is really, really a hard thing for some people to unpack that, yeah, just because I think this particular way or I am this particular way doesn't mean I can't change it. And that's huge. And some people may sit back and be listening to this and be saying, "Oh, I I can't, I can't change." And I hear this a lot from younger folks. I hear this a lot from some of our Gen Z folks. Um, and that's I don't know. I find it really sad in many respects.
Well,
Because we need to be able to change. We should be able to change.
and I think a sort of an argument that I've heard from therapists and also from people who don't want to go to therapy because they're afraid they're going to get a diagnosis and then that diagnosis is going to define their entire life. That this piece that we can change and we can grow and we can develop is so important because I think there are there's probably a multiplicity, as many different people as there are on this planet. There are ways to look at this, but sort of two camps I see is either I have this diagnosis and so this means that this is all that I will ever be and I'm always going to be kind of trapped in the worst tendencies of this diagnosis. Or the flip side is sort of this idea of things are hard for me and I would like to understand why and I would like to get tools to support myself because it's hard. And I know when I got my slew of diagnoses, it was really, I felt seen for the first time in my life. It was like, oh, there's a reason that time management is hard for me, or there's a reason I trip over my own feet, or which is a total real thing in ADHD. Just saw a video on it today. I can't pronounce it. It's preoccupation or something. Anyway, I'm
Something
sure
like that.
there's anyway, we can put it in our notes later, but um or OCD, like where my compulsions are coming from, or where my intrusive thoughts don't mean I'm a bad person. It's
Hmm.
just how a synapse fires in my brain that chucks rando thoughts at me.
Hmm.
Or I fawn because that's what I did to be safe. And so I think understanding that our brains are malleable is so powerful to go, there are certain things that mean that I operate in the world in certain tendencies or in certain ways, but I can create supports or I can rewire my brain. One thought that I've heard from therapists is that one day we're going to get to a point where we chuck the DSM out the window because we recognize that basically everything comes from trauma. and and how we've been taught to operate in the world. As the therapist in the room, Spencer, feel free to disagree with that
Oh
because a lot of
no.
people are going, I don't have trauma. How's that possible? Trauma is just experiences that we have that kind of can define how we operate in the world. And those definitions present themselves as disorders or or present themselves in different ways. Now, like we talked about a few episodes ago, um, there is a spectrum of neurotypicalness and neurodivergency that actually is in brain formation. So I think it's beautiful to put it in here. Different parts of your brain have different Like your prefrontal cortex is actually developed differently in neurodivergence than it is in neurotypicals. And
Hmm.
so there's an actual physical difference that they have been able to see in doing scans of the brain. And so you do operate differently. So there's the cases of like neurodivergency where no, this is how it is, but you can still provide supports and learn things for yourself. But a lot of the disorders are coming from trauma. And so the more that we understand why we do what we do, the more that you can heal those things. And there's always going to be those tendencies. There'll always be those compulsions, but you can learn to work around them. So I just want to put that plug in there. Our brain is it's a changeable thing. It's a malleable thing. And so the more that we learn, the more that we help things grow and change. I will get off my soapbox and I will hand it back off to you, Spencer.
No, you're good. So to answer your earlier question about long-term memory, that is generally stored in the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. And then there's a couple of other small areas, which is interesting because as we start out and we talk about all these different generalities in different parts of the brain, we need to keep in mind that there's memory parts all over the brain. I mean, if we were to map out where all the different parts of the brain collect memory, it's like there's vision memory, there's identification memory, there are memory parts and functions that are all over in the brain, and I think that's important to really unpack there. So um, yeah, I love what you say about trauma. I think one of the things that we don't realize a lot of the times with trauma is and in some textbooks and in some science research things we talk about grief and loss. And some people say, well, I'm not grieving anything. I haven't lost anything. Um, Folks, the fact of the matter is we do every day. Every day we're grieving the loss of something. Now, if you want to look at some big things, yeah, if we move, yeah, we're going to grieve the loss of our friends, of our home, all those different kinds of things. Um, and that's a little bit more traumatic. Speaking in front of a large group of people can be a very traumatic experience for some. So there can be a lot of different things that we don't realize are traumatizing to us, but have some long lasting effects. So I agree with that assessment that one day it's all going to come down to trauma and we're going to assess things from the circle of trauma because that's huge. That's absolutely a core part of the things that we're doing here. So,
And we also can grieve what we never had. Like we talk about grief like in context of people or
mhm,
animals or moves. And it's like, yes, these people aren't in our lives. Our favorite animal is no longer part of our life. And so we grieve loss. But I think also another powerful piece of grieving is the potential of what could have been. We or we grieve life going differently than we expected. I was talking to my therapist on Tuesday about how life is feeling really unfair right now. And I listed out all of those reasons, and she went, yeah, that's a lot. And I was like, vindication. But I also was able to sit with the thing that a lot of things are unfair right now. And as I left that and went back into the living of life, the amount of people I've run into that everyone that I've talked to is dealing with stuff. Like
mhm,
one person that I was talking to, it's a tree that's caused a leak in a pipe that is going to cost them $23,000. In the economy that we have right now, how in the heck do you swing that? Or talking to someone today, their husband just had a ginormous heart attack. And the thing that she took away from that was, I'm scared to answer the phone now. I can't imagine every time my phone ringing
mm,
expecting to get bad news. And
right.
that's not just like the trauma your husband almost died. That's
Hmm.
like every time the phone rings, you're reliving that.
Hmm.
And so there's just so many pieces. Or this is going to sound really funny. This is around loss. I totaled my car last year. I
Hmm.
grieved for like 6 months on that because not just because I love that car, but all the hopes and dreams I had for that car
Hmm.
were gone in one moment of slush.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of power in giving ourselves some slack because there is a lot that can there's a lot in our minds a lot in our life where our mind tells us it's supposed to be a certain way. And if it doesn't, when life doesn't measure up, that's really hard on our psyche. And so it's
Hmm.
okay. It's okay when you're sad. This answers the question we had a few weeks ago. What do I do when I'm just sad?
Hmm.
Accept that maybe life didn't go the way you expected and honor yourself that that hurts.
One of the things that I was thinking about while you were saying that, it's easy for us to Google, for example, the 10 major life stressors, right? You know, when we're talking about death, divorce, marital separation, imprisonment, personal injury, marriage, job loss, marital reconciliation, even retirement is in there. I'm like, retirement, that's something I'm looking forward to, right? But it can be a loss because it's part of our identity. But outside of all that, like I mean, I love the example you gave, about the woman who did not want to answer her phone, from that time forward, because we are faced with these things that happen to us, but we don't really realize, oh, hey, there's so many different things that could be triggering to us. Some people may not want to go out of their house because they fear, all these different things because they had somebody who got into a car accident or somebody who got hurt or all these different things. These things are really real things that we are grieving and experiencing trauma over. So those are the 10 big ones. And then off of that springs so many more. There's multitude of so many more other things that can cause these. And yet in life, we're supposed to just pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and keep going. And we're supposed to deal with it, right?
And not acknowledge that anything happened.
Yeah.
Like you
And
just keep
and
walking.
and that's why we're in the predicament that we are in as a nation right now. That's why road rage is so high. That's why people have so much mental psychosis right now is because we're not necessarily looking at this. We're not necessarily dealing with our stuff. We are just shoving it aside, burying it down deep, because we don't have time, right? How many times have we ever said, I don't have time to fall apart? I don't have time to deal with this. I am just going to whoosh, shove it aside.
I'm gonna put it off for another day,
Yeah.
and that other day never comes.
No, no,
It
it
never
doesn't.
comes.
No.
There's a scripture that has always intrigued me since I was a little girl, and it's that men's hearts will grow cold.
Hmm.
And I used to think all sorts of things about why that is and what it is. And the longer I live, the more that it is. Your heart can only carry around so much stuff before it has to freeze.
Hmm.
It can only face so much stuff without letting it go before it just stops being able to make connections. I uh, I know when I was trying to make some decisions about my own marriage a number of years ago, and I had just stopped feeling because I was carrying around a whole bunch of fear. I was carrying around a whole bunch of grief. I was carrying around so many things, and my answer was, I'm just gonna stop feeling. Like I don't want to feel this stuff. And so I consciously made a choice to go numb because it's like I don't have the tools because this was way before therapy me. So it's like I don't have the tools to work to face through any of this. I don't have the time to face any of this. I don't have the support for any of this. So we're just gonna lock it in a vault and chuck the key. But what I found is I couldn't feel happiness anymore. I couldn't feel peace anymore. I couldn't feel fulfillment anymore. Because if you tell your brain and your heart you're not feeling anymore, it's not selective of what you feel and what you don't feel. It just says, okay, we're going to shut this part of our brain off.
Hmm.
And I'm still feeling things from that time because I, it compounds. It compounds. And then when it finally comes out, if you don't want to acknowledge it, it's road rage. If you don't want to acknowledge it, it's disconnection from people. And once you finally acknowledge it, you don't really get a pick how much the spigot turns on. This is not to discourage you to not feel. This is just the realization that feeling is feeling is feeling. And so start feeling to have that connection again, to be able to regulate, to pull out of hypoarousal or hyperarousal and be the human being you want to be. Just know that that's a big piece is you have to choose to feel again. Because once you tell your brain don't feel, it will follow those instructions to the end of time.
Yeah.
I lost the
Yeah.
plot, but
No, it was
bring
good.
us back to the plot.
It's really good to reflect upon some of those things, but because yeah, a lot of us have shut different parts of ourselves down just to be able to survive. And sometimes we think, oh, we're just dealing with one particular thing, and then we don't realize that it has repercussions in another area. Just like you said, I had to shut down. So what did I do? I shut down my ability to feel happiness, and that's across the board,
Mhm.
right? It's not just happiness for birthday parties or happiness, but it's hard to feel happiness for other people. It's hard to feel happiness for, a good book or a good movie or, I mean, all these different things, whether they're superficial or not. It's just that part goes numb.
Mhm.
And that's, yeah. And we have to, like you said, decide to fire that back up again. So that's why, hopefully, those of you who are listening to this and are recognizing some of these things in your own body, recognizing some of these things that are going on happening in your own brain, will take notice as we describe these things and help you piece together some of the things that are going on. So as you visualize this, you can go, oh man, yeah, uh, that's what I'm doing. That's what's going on. That's why I don't feel this way, or that's why I do feel this way, and that'll hopefully help you see and bring a certain amount of awareness to your situation, to your symptoms, to your condition, and then you can address it. You can go, oh yeah, there is actually something going on here. There is actually a problem that needs addressing, and it takes time to work to rewire the brain. So, on that note, let's talk about the wiring of the brain.
Yes.
Because there are a lot of things to unpack here. So, our brains, usually we look at it, we see pictures of our brain and we look at this clump, right? And it looks like a wrinkled, shriveled raisin on the top of our head that we have, but that doesn't necessarily show us what's going on and happening inside of the brain. And when we use the term the wiring of our brain, that's a lot of what it's like. There's a lot of little wires going through our head. And as they're going through our head, these are the things that we call synapses. And the synapses are little things. They kind of remind me, I don't know, maybe this is just my visualization. Allison, you can add your own to this. But if you could picture two jellyfish, end for end, both of them with their heads together, they're not touching each other, but they're just kind of floating there. Well, the synapses are the same way. They don't necessarily touch in all the places. And in between the two heads of the jellyfish are little teeny tiny particles, for example. And that is the information that is being transferred from synapse to synapse. It is our neuro transmitters that are transmitting information to our brain. Now, there can be some problems with this. Sometimes one jellyfish may be sending some of that information over to another jellyfish. You see these little particles fly over there, but the other jellyfish is not necessarily picking those up. So the particles just bounce off and go elsewhere. And so we have a breakdown. We have a problem of information getting from one synapses to another. In some terms, you've probably heard some people say, well, my synapses are just not firing properly, right? And there is a lot of truth to that because if the synapses are either not firing properly or not reading properly, information is not getting to the various parts of the brain that it needs to, and then there is a
A
problem.
breakdown. A
Yeah,
problem, a breakdown. Things aren't working the way we hoped.
right. And so that's when we sit back and we say, okay, we need to look at this situation and figure out what is not firing the right way, what is not happening. And the cool part about this is if it's not working, we can generally try to figure out why these things are not working. So if we're talking about traumatic brain injuries, for example, yeah, there's some parts of the brain that have gone dormant, that have gone actually dark, if you look at a brain scan. And so we can look at these areas and say they're not firing. They're not, information is not being transmitted where it needs to be. And there's a lot of different things that we can do to try to help those out. One of them is some of these psychoeducational skills that we talk about in this podcast. And I know a lot of other folks who are doing podcasts and different things like that. Once you develop skills, those skills can help us fire up those parts of our brain again and start working and start receiving. So there's receivers, there's senders, and the receivers are receptors, right? They're receiving information into the brain, and then things flow, like they should. So our brains are made up of all these great big huge wire factors, these synapses that are sending information along the synapses to other synapses to be able to communicate. Hey, I am in pain. I just stubbed my toe. Ouch, that hurts, right? And it sends information to the brain as far as, hey, I want to make a choice. I want to make a decision. I can recognize you. I remember that. And all these different things are happening simultaneously. And some of them happening in have to fire off all at the same time, or else there's different parts that are missing. So if our memory parts are not firing off, it doesn't necessarily matter what we can see because we can't remember what we are looking at. So you can see where, okay, memory has to fire, vision has to fire, recognition has to fire, right? And they do it all at the same time in order to bring that one, oh, hey, I recognize your face. I know who you are. And all of that comes into place. So the complexity of our brains is absolutely huge. And when you said earlier, Allison, the fact that I just lost it as soon as I said that. I was like, but essentially our brains are really, really complex. And if there's some damage somewhere in there, we have to be able to find a way to either reprogram or see if we can open up some of those parameters.
I
Go
have
for it.
thoughts.
Yeah, I love go for the thoughts.
Um, and there's so many places. Okay, number one, this is why early detection of stroke is so important because all of this that Spencer just described happens because you have blood flow to the brain.
Mm,
And so a stroke is basically when a blood vessel bursts somewhere in your upper part towards your brain. And so your brain is not getting the oxygen it needs from the blood flow. And so, like Spencer said, certain parts of your brain go dark depending on where that aneurysm occurred. So if people's face starts like if their face starts drooping, or if there is slurred speech, or if they smell toast, any of those things, like it's a joke, but burnt toast is one of the symptoms. So if people's like, what is that weird smell, actually ask them questions and engage with them, because stroke recovery is totally possible if caught early enough.
hmm
And even then after that, you can have recovery because, like Spencer said, we're training those synapses to do what synapses do again, because our brain is very recovery oriented. So one is just physical damage, whether that's like an external brain injury or an internal brain injury. You're probably like, what in the heck does that have to do with a journey to therapy, bridging the gap to therapy? Grief, traumatic life events, take your pick. But
Hmm.
We don't talk about it enough. And I think it's just important for people to understand that that is a piece. Those are
Hmm.
things we should be paying attention to. Second, Spencer, you mentioned synapses, receivers and senders.
Hmm.
Yep, we're going to go with that. That message actually happens in two different ways.
Hmm.
It happens either with a protein that's released or an
Hmm.
electrical charge. So
Hmm.
when you're talking about the brain going dark, it's like legitimately doesn't have an ability to conduct energy anymore,
Hmm.
which I think is really cool. So
Really
those are
cool
kind
that it doesn't.
of, no, really
I'm
cool
just
that
kidding.
like that we see physical manifestations of what's
Yeah.
happening in the brain.
Hmm.
Um, so that's the external damage side. The internal damage side is when you have thoughts consistently enough, you are strengthening certain synapses to receive, to send and receive more than other ones will. And so if this trauma has created a definition for us, we strengthen that definition over and over and over again. Nobody loves me. A coworker glances at you sideways. Nobody loves me. Somebody cuts in front of you in traffic. Nobody loves me. You're not invited to a party. Nobody loves me. And so those receptors send the senders send more, the receptors are ready to receive all of that. And so these cognitive tools Spencer is talking about is we recognize those thoughts for what they are, that they're
Hmm.
not necessarily true. Yes, they were true maybe at one time in our life, but that doesn't define us for the rest of our lives. And that's cognitive behavioral therapy, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Dead on.
beautiful.
Yeah.
So we just train our brain to see things in a new way.
Hmm.
Um, Trauma can create plaque and it covers those senders and receivers so that you just can't complete a thought. So I struggled so much when I was first starting my journey with affirmations because it wouldn't send. I would be like, I am an awesome human being. And my brain's like, we don't have the program or the pathway for that. You're cute. And so I had to actually do the trauma work and find the emotions and find the memories and find the pain that had created that plaque, stopping the sending of that new message. And people are like, well, if plaque is built up over synapses, what in the heck does healing trauma have to do with that? We'll talk about that later. But it is just important to know that plaque can actually build up in your brain and it stops things. The Vietnamese example I used a little bit ago, plaque built up, or well, it did because I had started having a lot of negative feelings because of everything that was attached to my mission ending early, never really learning the language, my language teacher telling me that I sounded awful and I shouldn't speak for the next few weeks. It
Oh,
was
wow.
rough. So, hello, plaque. Don't learn it for 12 years. That
Hmm.
pathway just slowly withers. So,
Hmm.
the more times that we use pathways, the more that they get stronger and the more you're naturally going to go to that pathway.
Hmm.
And so, it is so important to be aware of what you're thinking and how often your thoughts loop, because that affects what you strengthen. Spencer, one other thing.
Hmm.
And of course, because I just said that, I too forgot it. Here we go.
Yeah,
Do,
right.
do, 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 do. Um, oh, when you're dissociating, so this is from the last episode.
Yeah.
When you're dissociating, you forget kind of where you went,
Hmm.
but it's so important to think of that last thought that you thought before you went a different direction,
Hmm.
because that last thought you thought is plaque built up over this synapses, so your brain doesn't let you go there, and so it runs away and it dissociates somewhere else because there's nowhere for that thought to go. So that thought is telling you, oh, we can't go here, there is no bridge here, there is no pathway through this. And so if you are seeing that, if you're recognizing these blocks, that's when in therapy, that's when in these different processes, journaling different ways, you can start clearing off that block and go down that path.
Hmm.
Okay, we are about at time. And I'm gonna let you, I promise we'll come back to all the other things that we promised you. But I will hand it off to you, Spencer, because I know you have some thoughts and it's not fair of me to cut you off.
No,
So
you're good. No, this is really good. We can dive into other things too. One of the things I was thinking about was neuroplasticity, and that's a huge part of this too. Our ability to respond to learning new things and stuff. And I think that this is one of the reasons why People sit back and say, psychology is ridiculous. Therapists are a quack, right? We don't really buy into this because some people sit back and say, "Oh, well, if I say positive affirmations every day, ha ha ha, yeah, my synapses are gonna fire off differently." Well, yeah, they are. And sometimes we sit back and we think, oh, something so simple, is it really going to fix or change or alter or open up those pathways again? And it really does. Going back to your example of when you shut down, right? And you blocked out all the happy feel goods, right?
Hmm.
And that was a time for your brain to shut down some of those neural pathways. And the synapses were saying, okay, we're going to move away from those. We don't really need them right now. We need stuff in other places. And when we don't use those, then we get to the point, weeks, months, years down the road, and we go, why can't I feel this feeling? Why can't I feel the way I used to?
Hmm.
Right. And that's what I think is interesting. And it really it comes down to mind over matter. It's working through these different things in a therapeutic setting, whether we're doing cognitive behavioral therapy, and talking through things and challenging some of the thought processes that we have. And when we challenge those, it's like exercise, right? The brain's a muscle.
Hmm.
Yeah, right. And so we just have to exercise those portions of our mind in order to help us move forward in our whole thought process. But as Allison said, we are at time, and so we always like to end things off on the right note and talk to you, yes, you personally, because this is important. Your mind is a beautiful mind. It is a wonderful, fabulous working system that allows you to do so many wonderful and amazing things. Why? Because you are amazing and you are wonderful just the way you are. And if you've gone through this time with us here today and you've sat back and you've thought, oh man, there's problems, there's issues. Yeah, that's okay. We're right there with you. We are right there hand in hand in the same situation. We all have things that we're working on. But the beautiful part about it is your self-worth is something that is innately given to you, no questions asked. You are a wonderful person. You are who you are because you have come this far in your life. And every day is a special day. Every day is a wonderful day. Every day is a good day. So look around, find some wonderful things to be grateful for because I am grateful for you and grateful for our time each week as we talk about these amazing, amazing things, the human body, which is you. It's you. Thanks for being here, everybody. Thanks for being a part of our time, and thank you for being part of our discussion. And I look forward to chatting with you again next week.
Because we have some very awesome things in store. As you noticed, we promised the trifecta. We are on leg number one of the trifecta. But I think it's a good foundation we need for everything else that is coming to help each of us understand ourselves better. I think that's a beautiful gift to give our awesome selves. I do want to take this moment and offer our disclaimer that we are not your medical professional. We are not your therapist. We are not sort of in your specific care team. If you are experiencing distress or concern or overwhelm, please reach out to them. Um, if you're like, I don't even know what I'm looking for, I don't even know what I'm doing, please reach out to us. We have some knowledge and some skill sets to help you point you in the right direction so that you can get the help you need for yourself specifically because you are worth getting that support and you are worth getting that help. We are a start. We hope that we're giving you new ideas and questions and things. But also, it is so important to have help that is catered to you. And we hope that you utilize all of the resources that are in front of you. And if you don't know what they are, we will try and point you in some directions to the best of our abilities. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with us. We are so excited to talk to you next week.